I'm here to help you think about how writing both could be useful to you, but how to do it in a way that's more effective, more efficient, that takes less time, that's less frustrating, that lets you actually say the things you want to say. So often I hear from students, have this idea, and then there's whatever it is that you've written, and the difference between the two is vast. Or it takes you forever, or you start to write and you get unmotivated for a number of reasons, and then you're on Facebook for 45 minutes. Or it's the day before it's due and you're trying to figure out some kind of shortcut that will let you finish it. We want you to get the writing that you deserve, to perform the writing that you're capable of, to demonstrate your intelligence, and to take pity on your poor professor who's going to have to read all of these things and hopefully can be impressed by what you have to offer instead of shake her head quietly while she's reading your work. So once you've got paper in front of you, don't think too hard about this, and I actually mean that. Just write what actually comes to you. I'm not going to collect it, although I will ask you to use it, so you should do it. What is your writing process? When you sit down to write an essay, literally, what happens? What do you do? You can make a list if you want, you can use sentences, informal writing. What is your writing process? So what do you have written down? Who wants to be brave and share first? Yes.
I sketch a rough outline, then I write the meat of my essay, the body bits, the content. Then I write the introduction, and I use that to write the conclusion. Then I get some cookies or milk or snack or something and watch an episode of something. Then once that's all done, I go back and read it so it's not fresh in my mind.
Good. Anyone else?
I research articles and databases. I read. I watch movies and pay attention to my surroundings. I watch YouTube videos. I write down every idea I get. I find books on the topic, and then all of that I do to develop ideas. And it takes a couple days to process, and then eventually all these things bang off in my mind, and I can sit down with all my materials and write.
Good.
I know people say there are no right answers and then they never really mean it, but I'm interested in a diversity of approaches, so if yours doesn't sound like anyone else's, that's great. It's okay.
Usually I kind of like talk it out first and like try just saying it a few times and seeing what points kind of are reoccurring, and then I try and flush out those points a little more, and then try and develop like a thesis idea and then fill out the rest of it.
Okay, good. Who do you talk with?
Myself.
With yourself?
Yeah.
Does anyone involve other people in their writing process? You do?
I do.
Anything else? Yeah.
I procrastinate, and then I try and write some phrases, and until I find a reason to start making figures, and then I stop writing and make figures instead.
Okay. Anyone have one more final? There we go.
I also procrastinate, but then I'll research the topic to try to get things going in my head a bit. And then I just start writing, just spew whatever I can on the paper until I hit like the required length or the limit. And then I go back and clean it up, and then I'll look at it the next day, which is usually the day it's due, and clean it up some more.
All right. So there's some common themes here. There's a lot of either Netflix or YouTube or general procrastination involved, which is fairly typical. There's also a real emphasis on research as this place where you go seemingly to get ideas or inspiration or content. And then some kind of process occurs where you do research, which is this process that you describe as doing research without necessarily knowing exactly what that means. And then that turns into content magically, right? It's like a sausage factory where you know, at the end of the day, you've got your hot dog, and sometimes you don't ask questions if it just shows up. What we want to do today, first of all, is make some of this more transparent to give you more agency, more capability, and control over what happens, making those decisions. And also to talk about the moments where then you're less motivated, you're frustrated, you hit that procrastinating moment, right? Or you wonder why something is taking 3 hours instead of 20 minutes. The way that I think is most effective to start thinking about this is in terms of genre. Now this is a term that you've all heard before, right? What does genre mean? What does it describe? What's a genre? I know you know this because you're in my other class.
Just say what you're thinking. It doesn't have to be about
Yeah.
writing.
Or give an example
What do
of
you
one if
think
you
of
want.
when you think of genre?
Just like a group of, something that's similar,
Yeah.
and it's normally in like the arts or something.
Yeah, so I would think of music or
Yeah.
movies.
Right. I think about like a romantic comedy. If you go to see a romantic comedy in the theater, right, there are things that you can guarantee will happen, right? You can guarantee that there's some kind of love triangle, right? There's some kind of witty best friend who is saying the things to the people involved that the audience would say if only they had the power to speak to the characters. There'll be some kind of conflict that splits up these two people who are obviously going to be together anyway, and eventually it will be resolved by them being together. There are no romantic comedies that do not do that. There are none, right? You can have an animated film with animals, right? You can have films in foreign languages. They all do that. Genres are, right, groups of similar things. They're things that have rules, right? And these rules have to be followed or else they're not that thing, right? A donut without a hole is a Danish. Right? It's in Caddyshack, so everybody's doing that movie.
Yeah, write that down.
Yeah, right. Right, there are things that are and then they cease to be. Genres are really, really useful to think about because they limit what you're responsible for. If you had to write a romantic comedy, you could just write that content, right? That bare bones outline would be done in 10 minutes. And now you're just trying to think about clever things that people say to each other. Right? If you know what it's supposed to look like, you know the rules, this means you also know the expectations of your audience and of your reader. You know what they are looking for. And you're there to deliver something to them. Right? Not everything is creative writing and a moment of a time for you to just personally express whatever you want. You're doing something for an audience. So being aware of genre means being aware of your audience, right, and their expectations. And this means being aware of conventions. Conventions can be described as those rules or those moves within a genre that need to be done, right? A conventional aspect, a typical, common aspect. What are some conventional moves in the writing that you're all doing for this class? What are things that you imagine will be in the papers you're writing? Vocabulary, structure, arguments. What exists? What are things that you know at some point you'll do?
Like we have to do like an abstract and an introduction to the
Okay.
method section.
So, right, so there's the genre of the abstract, right, which has a certain length, which has certain qualities to it, right, certain conventions.
So as the person who is grading the method sections right now, I would like to hear what you think language, common language is, because I'm seeing the same language over and over again. And I think we need to talk about that. What's the kind of language that is conventional? We've talked about some of it already.
Well, certainly we try to be as objective as possible.
Objective?
Try not to have like, oh, I really like this, or like I really like the way that this worked out.
Something about the voice, or the role of the author and the speaker in the essay. It's probably, I don't know, it's been a very long time since I've taken a physics class. I'm trying to remember if it was the 90s or if it turned into the next millennium or not. But certainly some kind of quantitative analysis, some kind of data, right?
Okay, here's the word I see a lot of: determine. We determined, and we. What's the other one I see? We determined something, or we. We observed. We obtained. We. Found that we. Those are words that we see a lot of.
Do you like those words?
Sometimes.
So you can only use them sometimes. Or you should look at examples, right? How do you learn conventions, right? How do you know what a romantic comedy is? Because you've seen a romantic comedy. How do you know what a good sci-fi movie is? Because you've seen good ones and you've seen bad ones. And you can tell the difference very quickly because you know them, right? You need to look at examples. You need to practice doing it yourself, right? What is readable? What comes across as credible? This is a question, here's a fancy-ish word, ethos. Right? Ethos, right, like the word ethical, refers to the character, the credibility of the author. You want to be someone who's being read and taken seriously. In order to do that, you need to show that you know the conventions of the genre in which you're writing. You need to demonstrate that you're aware of the audience for whom you're writing, what their expectations are. Not annoying them by using the wrong language, repeated language too much, by digressing, right? And if you start off by understanding what those expectations are and using those as rules for yourself, then both during the process and in later periods of reflection and revision, you'll be much more effective and efficient at getting the work that you want. I'm going to turn things over to Lee Olson now, and we'll start talking about the nitty-gritty of doing that.
Okay, so there's handouts going around that we prepared for you, something for you to take away. And going off of this idea of ethos and being able to support yourself and maintain trustworthiness and credibility, this is what I think of when I think of ethos, is maintaining your credibility mostly. So we have these conventions, and sometimes they're a pain in the butt to follow, but there's a reason that we follow conventions, and it's because as part of education or as part of the workforce or whatever you're doing, you're taking part in a larger conversation. So you're like when you're researching, you're taking in all this information. When you're in class, you're taking in all this information, and then you need to be able to start to form your own ideas and do your own research and put these ideas out there. So to communicate this, you need to be able to write, and you need to be able to write effectively, and you need to be able to maintain that credibility. So today we're going to focus a little bit on errors. So maybe Professor Larson told you that the title of this workshop is looking for patterns of error in your own writing. So looking at your handout here, first of all, a couple problems with making mistakes or making errors in your writing. One thing it's going to do, it's going to make it so that your writing is unclear, so that people don't understand what you're trying to say. So I would say that's probably the most important thing, is trying to get your message across and make people understand what it is that you're trying to say. The second thing that you need to be aware of is that if you're making mistakes or errors, whoever is reading your paper is going to start to doubt your credibility. Okay? So even if it makes sense to them on some level, if they understand what you're trying to get across, if your paper is full of errors, they're going to start to doubt you as a person, and your credibility is going to suffer. So just briefly, I want to make a distinction between mistakes and errors. So you can look at it on here, but what I would explain, a mistake to me is something that you did inadvertently. You knew the convention, you knew what you were supposed to do, but it slipped your mind, or when you were proofreading, you missed something. So this would be like submitting a paper that had a typo in it, something that you knew what was correct, but you just overlooked it. Versus an error, which is something that you genuinely don't know. So there are lots of conventions in English. It's a very complicated language, and it's hard to remember all those things if you ever learned them, and a lot of things we just never really learned them. So these would be things like a comma splice. Does anyone know what a comma splice is? Could you explain that? Okay. So I use this example because it's something that's very common, and you might know it, but you wouldn't know it to hear that name. So you probably haven't heard it since 8th grade English or something. So a comma splice would be like connecting two sentences with a comma. Okay, so you're running two thoughts together instead of separating the two sentences with a full stop, with a period, or separating them with a colon. or something. Okay, so this is an example of a convention that you maybe learned somewhere along the way, but you forgot it, or you never learned it. So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah, sure.
What about things where sort of the opposite is true, that you can say the rule, but you still have a hard time following it? The example I'm thinking of is, so we all know not to put in superfluous stuff in our papers in the sections that we're working on now. And yet, it's easy to say that, and yet we still do. We put in sentences that are way too long and have way too much stuff in them, and when we could have just said it much more succinctly. So I think, you know, if I quizzed everybody in this room, we would all know that we shouldn't do that, and yet we still do it anyway. Those are the things I think that we're collectively really struggling with.
Okay. So I think that's definitely a tendency, especially in academic writing, that you feel this need to sound smart. And to sound smart, you start using big words and you start creating really long sentences. So when you're writing, I would suggest that you're always looking for this, that you're not using a big word if it's not necessary, or you're not letting your sentences run on too long.
Yeah, and I often find that, I often find the first paragraph of my writing, and certainly of my students' writing in their first drafts, is almost always this kind of pre-thinking. I'm writing myself into what I'm eventually going to write, and I can tell the students who've not reflected on their writing, reflected on their work, because those paragraphs are still there as this kind of scaffolding, you know, walking themselves into what they're going to do. And I see sentences like this from the stage in your writing where you're still forming your ideas, you're still figuring out what you want to say, so you're writing it and not worrying about the way it looks, which is okay sometimes. Right? So if I wrote, "Hey Olson, you're great, and please keep talking. The one time I went to your workshop was rad," and this other, right, and you're just throwing commas in to maybe keep things going. They're not grammatically sound, or you're not ending sentences, or right, if instead of was rad, I said, you know, was exceptionally, you know, well articulated with diligent attention, and you know, just and went on. And was like, just tell me it was good, and so we can move on. Right? What is it your audience wants? Do they want big words? Do they need big words? Do you, as you enter this field and become the audience, do you want to read those things?
So this is an example of a comma splice. Okay, so Mr. Einhorn here demonstrated two sentences being connected with a comma where they should have been separated with a period or a semicolon, or many ways to do it. But, yeah.
Just end the sentence. Let it die. Start over. Move on.
So kind of going off what your professor said, don't be afraid to have short sentences, because you don't want to run the risk of being superfluous, as she said, because the reader's mind might start straying and it's hard to follow a really long sentence, especially if you're using really complex jargon or something. So, let's see, I have a couple questions on here, just going off of this. Are there any conventions that you know of that you have a problem with?
Think about physics writing in particular.
And if you don't know the name, just try to give us the idea of it.
Well, I know one thing I've struggled with is keep remembering that data is plural.
Right, datum and data.
Yeah.
Do you want them to write them down first? Or?
Yeah, why don't you take a minute to try to think of some things, and you can jot them down. And like I said, if you don't know the name as you would see it in a grammar book, just try to think of the concept of it.
You can also think about what is it you found yourself criticized for, even if you weren't sure how or why you were supposed to do that. Is it something that you feel like you're supposed to know but don't know? What are these things?
So what are some things that you're coming up with? Maybe some voices that we haven't heard yet.
Avoiding using a passive voice while not continually saying we did this, we do that, here's that, etc.
Okay. So passive versus active voice. You all know about this.
Maybe.
Yeah, we talked about this quite a bit.
Okay. So what else?
First draft of my writing, I notice going back and editing it, I tend to have lots of run-on sentences.
Okay.
so that this always comes out in the first draft, but then not always after.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're aware of that.
Why do you think you have run-ons?
I don't know. I think in the first draft it's more like the ideas are just sort of pouring out, and you're somewhat less concerned with grammar and punctuation, that sort of thing. It's more about content.
Yeah. And this is all right, by the way. This is why writing in stages, having revision, time to revise is so important. Because there are times where you've got something you want to say, right? It's like, I have no time for commas. I need to get this out right now, right? Or I have no time to think about whether or not the spelling makes sense or the grammar works. This is an idea. And that's okay, but that means you also need to give yourself time to make sure that people know that you're not the kind of person who turns in finished work with run-on sentences, so you don't completely erode your credibility.
Great. So what else?
A lot of the times I say something and then I say the same thing again, but just in different words, even though I feel like I'm actually saying something different.
Yeah. I do that constantly. Mostly when I'm lecturing.
Anyone else?
I don't exactly know how to use a semicolon.
Good.
I don't use a semicolon, don't look at me.
Okay. So sometimes you would have two sentences that are a very closely related idea. And so rather than having one run-on sentence, you would use it to show that these two sentences are a related idea. So they're close enough that you don't want them to be two separate sentences, but you don't want them to be the same sentence. It's kind of an in-between ground.
Olson, I love your shirt. Did it cost a lot of money? If you had a comma here, this would be a comma splice. You've got these two, right, independent clauses, these two complete sentences, right? And you want to link them together because you want them to seem like they're part of one thought. But you don't want someone to die of asphyxiation attempting to read the sentence without breathing. That's why the semicolon exists, to join things together more tightly than they would be if there were a period. It's an optional piece of punctuation. Nobody thinks less of you if you haven't included a semicolon on the page. Can I bring us back to repetition for a second? Why do we repeat ourselves when we're writing?
Because the idea doesn't feel like presented enough, or
Good. Yeah, that's usually it, right? You're trying to say something, right, and you haven't quite got it. I think of it as, right, I in no way practice archery or have any idea how to use a bow and arrow, but I imagine if I did, I would take several shots and I would hope that I would get closer and closer to the bullseye. And at some point, I might have the bullseye completely circled, right? The bullseye cannot escape. It is surrounded by arrows. But I haven't quite hit it yet. I've got 1,000 arrows around it. I haven't hit it. Right? Sometimes you can have 10 sentences, and none of them says exactly what it is you're trying to say, but they all have a piece of what you're trying to say. And either you get frustrated or you run out of time, and you end up submitting this paragraph that is 10 sentences in the attempt to say ultimately what you know one or two should be saying. You've got to give yourself time to deal with that.
I think the other time that I do it is when it's an important point. So I think if I say it enough, then the reader will know that it's important. And in looking at our method sections yesterday, we do a lot of that right at the end where we counted up how many exoplanets have Earth-like temperatures. And there's like all this extra verbiage around that because there was 10 or however many there was. And so I think we don't just want to say 10 of the planets had temperatures within this range. We said, well, we sorted it and we looked at it, and like here's reiterating why we were looking at this, and the, drum roll please, there were 10. And I think that sometimes we say that kind of stuff to emphasize a point.
That's right, and I think that's a great point. And I know I do that in my classes. If something's really important and I want my students to get it, I will say it over and over and over again. So even if they've tuned out at some point, when they tune back in, it's still there, right? Sometimes your repetition comes from confusion, not being clear, right? Sometimes it comes from really wanting to make sure that someone understands that. Being able to pick and choose your moments, right? Intentional emphasis as opposed to unintentional or passive repetition is an important distinction, and it's one that an audience will pick up. If they feel like, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing, they're just sort of waving their hands looking for whatever's in front of them, right? You give off that sense by specificity, right? By justification for your writing, by someone feeling, oh, hey, this is really important, so it's worth taking time on, right? As opposed to, there's, this is like a treasure hunt with a map, and there are different pieces scattered around the paragraph. You don't want that. You don't want your academic writing to seem like a riddle. You had your hand up.
How about hyphens and dashes?
You mean the difference between them?
And when should you use them?
Okay. So first of all, a hyphen is like the smallest dash that you would see. So you would use this to combine words. So if there was a two-part word, this is what you would use. And it's a little guy. And then there's also, there's a dash that's a little bit bigger than that, and this is what you would use like for number ranges. So a lot of people would use this as the same as an end dash, but I think what you're asking about is an M dash, which is even larger. So this is something that you would use similar to a parentheses. So if you were trying to add a little blurb that wasn't necessarily vital for that sentence, you might use this. So you would set something off like this. So you have your sentence and then a little bit of extra information, and then you continue your sentence, same as if you were using parentheses. Or you might just have it at the end of a sentence. So you would end your sentence with an M dash like this.
Very dramatic.
Yeah.
What? Almost like ...
Or sometimes people will use a colon at the end of their sentence, and that's kind of like, I'm going along with this idea, and then, but wait for it, drum roll, and then they give you something else. So this is just another way of doing it.
I would imagine you're not leaving a lot of cliffhangers in your writing, right? This isn't like, wait for my next article in which I answer all of these amazing questions. You want to focus on clarity, you want to focus on meeting the expectations of your readers. You want to think about, if I had to read this and I wanted to understand this as quickly and clearly and intelligently as possible, what would I want to see? There are times where you really want to set something off, and so we come to this conclusion, long dash, and then here it is, right? This is the big moment. This is the sentence you should know, right? Almost like putting something in a bold font. But it's pretty rare that you're going to want to do that, and pretty rare that you're going to have to patronize, and in some sense, it's like bumper bowling, right? If you go bowling and you put bumpers in the gutters, right? Your audience is intelligent, is well-versed, is experienced. They know where to look for these things. So you can also learn to trust your audience as well. When in doubt, go with the most direct, basic, understandable approach you have. There's a writing center on campus. Did you know this? Have any of you ever been to the writing center on campus?
Who's been there?
1, 2 people who look scared to admit it. The writing center is not just for English majors. The writing center is not just for humanities or social science majors. The writing tutors are not only interested or able to work with humanities or English-related papers. They, like us, understand that good writing comes from understanding the conventions of the text and meeting those standards so that you can give the audience what they expect in a way that won't put them to sleep, right? In a way that will make them interested in what you have to say. If we're serious about writing, we're serious about meeting our expectations, fulfilling our goal, purposefully writing. Writing so it's not a waste of your time. Writing so you're not looking for a way to distract yourself. Writing so that when you have that moment of resistance where you don't know what to do, or you get anxious or you get confused, you don't just go and watch 4 episodes of something and then come back and it's 3 a.m. so I'm going to bed. And I'll just wake up early and do it right before class. Right? The Writing Center exists to short circuit all of these ways you have of avoiding not understanding and helping you get right to what really matters. They're not going to change your writing. They're not going to turn into an English paper. They're not here to infect or infiltrate you. And I only bring these things up not because you necessarily believe that, but I've heard this from students. And there are these pernicious rumors about, these wacky liberal arts people who don't understand anything, who just roam halls of libraries. You're liberal arts vampires, I guess. You should take advantage of this. You know when your papers are due. You can know in your mind when you're really going to start or when you're going to hit that wall. And if you go in here and you have someone look at it and read it and say, these are 3 practical things you can do that will help you, right? Well, here is where I see you doing this. We're talking about recognizing your own patterns of error, recognizing the conventions that matter in what you do. And sometimes you're not sure what they are. But someone can read your work who's trained and effective at doing this and say, here's where you're doing something that makes a lot of sense in your convention. Here's where you're doing something that's really successful. Here's where you're not. Let's talk about the difference between these 2 things and making your whole paper look as successful as this section. I want you to now think about, go back to that piece of paper you wrote about your process, and think about one thing you could do to improve your process. It can be based on something we talked about today. It can be based on something else you've been thinking about doing. What is one thing, practical, easily deployable thing you can do to improve your writing practice? So what are you going to do?
Leave myself some time between writing it and going back to it.
That's right. Because you're not going to see, right, when we had these errors or mistakes up, you just won't see them and you won't have time. So that's a great strategy. What else? Let's see. Yeah.
Well, not worry about what won't work as you're writing. That's what editing's for.
That's right.
So just get your ideas out.
Right. And making sure to leave yourself time so that you can worry about it later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone else to read your paper?
Yeah. Right? They have a different set of eyes, different set of priorities. I think those are great. Certainly going to office hours, right? Especially if your professor is circling things on your paper, and you don't know what to do about that or you don't know what it means, you need to go find out, right? You're about to graduate, right? You need to take responsibility for what you know how to do and for what you don't know how to do yet. And you need to be the one who determines, okay, what do I still need to know? Who can I ask to get this information from? How can I make sure I know it and that I show someone that I know how to do that? This is on you now. We'll finish up by looking at a couple of revision strategies and common errors, things for you to sort of keep at the front of your mind that have real quick fixes or at least quick approaches.
Right. So I think you guys know that the 2 of the greatest things you can take away is to take time in your writing, make it a process instead of a night before kind of thing, and also go to other people. So it doesn't have to be a solo endeavor. I think I'm guilty of that, of trying to write all by myself without passing it by other people, but it's invaluable to do that. So just to help you along with that, we've given you this handout. So first of all, down at the bottom is my email address. So this Lee is a very busy man. He teaches a lot of classes. I'm a student, so I have a little bit more free time, but I'm available to meet with you if you need help with your writing process or with editing, proofreading, anything. So feel free to contact me. My office hours are on there. And also there's a couple addresses on there for online resources through the school. So Lee mentioned the Writing Center. They do have an online service now where they have some software where you can submit a document up to, I think, 6 pages, or you could submit different segments that you need help with, and they can do it online. So they will essentially do what they would do in an appointment, where they'll go over it and they can record themselves speaking about it, and then they'll send it back to you. So
let me also point this out, right? Part of being aware of these issues, there's a lot of them, and we all succumb to them, right? I succumb to them, your professor does, right? We have our patterns, we have our things we have our time pressures and our exhaustions. You need to give yourself time not just to go back and edit, but to go back and edit for different things. Going back and doing different passes, right? I'm going to read this now and I'm only going to look at my commas. I'm not going to look at the words. I'm not going to look at the sentences, right? The content. I'm going to make sure that my commas are working, right? Maybe the next time I'm going to look, any word that looks like it's bigger than this, I'm going to see if it needs to be there. Give yourself a focused pass, right? A targeted approach So you're not distracted, so it goes quickly, so it goes effectively. If you try to look for everything at once, you find nothing. If you try to look for only one thing, it's much easier to see.
So, and thanks for pointing out this list. This would be the next thing I would talk about. So these are some examples of conventions and how they would be violated. But take note of my note at the bottom that this is not a comprehensive list. So there are so many conventions and it's hard to learn them all, but these are some of the most violated conventions in academic writing. So have a look at those. And then on the next page, we've come up with a list of some revising, editing, and proofreading strategies. So you can have a look at those. And the last page is about some sample misspellings, common misspellings, because of course that's one thing that we all probably mess up on a lot of times is sound alike words and words that we just accidentally misspell.
So we're about out of time. If you completely zoned out during this entire thing or have trouble remembering it an hour from now, remember just these things, right? Understanding the conventions of the writing that you're doing, who your audience is, what they expect, right? Knowing how to look at your work, giving yourself time not just to do a good job, but using that time effectively, making good passes through your work. Understanding what your perspective and your persona is as an author, how you want to be received as much as someone's going to receive you, right? And learning to become more aware of your abilities and your strategies, your mistakes, and using the resources that are available to you for free. People exist to help you here, who want to help you.